taking the easy way out today. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to my video, which is kind of me shortcutting the mid-year booktube freakout tag by not answering any of the tag questions, but instead just talking about my top 5 reads of the year so far in 2024. So I have 5 top reads. They're all fiction, and I have some honorable mentions I just want to run through real quickly here. So to start with the honorable mentions, the first is Fingerbone by Hiroki Takahashi. This is a novel. It's a piece of historical fiction set among a group of Japanese soldiers on the island of New Guinea during World War II. And it really kind of discusses the slow attrition, the deaths, the kind of rituals that the Japanese practice in terms of returning parts of the body to their families because the whole bodies couldn't be returned. Is this kind of really inevitability about the outcome. And I just thought it was a really great depiction of soldiers at war, not necessarily the violence involved, but the bonds that are created between them, their relationship to the people and place in which they live, and to the kind of growing sense of hopelessness that Japanese soldiers experience. The next book on my list I have is Inner Ghost by Isabella Hamad. This was one of the books that was nominated for, I believe, made the short list for the Women's Prize for Fiction this year. It's set it's set in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, and it kind of explores, tells the story of a group of actors who are going to put on Hamlet as a play, and they plan on staging it in the West Bank region, and it really kind of threads through a lot of the issues, a lot of the things that have gone on in the past between Israel and Palestine, and the kind of current situation. It gives a glimpse into the lives of Palestinians, some who live in Israel. The main character lives in Haifa with her sister, to Palestinians who live in the West Bank, where there were constant closures and colonization and changes, to Palestinians who live in Gaza and the struggles they have there. And it's all kind of wrapped up around the story of the play of Hamlet, or this production of Hamlet. And the play and the story told, I think, are meshed together really perfectly, really powerfully, and I think the book is structured and written in a really creative and powerful way. The next book on my list is Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. I reviewed this book. I'll leave a link, if I remember, I'll leave a link to the review I have down below. This is kind of the sequel to There, which was Orange's debut novel. It picks up some of the same characters recovering from the trauma that is depicted in There, and then the struggles that they face across generations in terms of substance abuse and depression, illness, all kinds of other family matters. I just thought it was really poignant, really beautiful, and the character of the person who kind of steps in and plays the grandmother role is really powerful and really, really well done. I just thought it was really beautiful. And then I also wanted to mention Erasure by Percival Everett here. This was the first Percival Everett novel I read this year, and it is the book upon which the movie, the Oscar-nominated movie American Fiction, was based, which depicts the story, or it's the story of a black writer who writes, what we would call serious literary fiction, which gets a lot of critical acclaim but doesn't sell very well, and he's having a hard time placing his newest novel, which is, a work of literary fiction. At the same time this is going on, he's seeing the success of other black authors who are writing, more about life in among gangs and streets and in poor neighborhoods, and he's kind of frustrated by this whole situation, and so he decides to write his own book like that. He takes on the persona of a former prisoner and gang member, and he writes this book, and he intends for it to be kind of a joke, but when his agent sends it out to publishers, they take it seriously. They want to publish it, and it becomes this kind of whole dilemma for him in this idea of him producing a book, which is more or less like the exact kind of book he was in some ways attempting to satirize. And it really is this kind of visceral look, I think, at the publishing industry and the world of writers and writing. And there's also a really powerful kind of a family story that goes along with it. I just thought it was a really great book. I wanted to mention it here. The next 3 books on my list of honorable mentions are all Nonfiction, the first is 9th Street Women by Mary Gabriel. This is the story of the female artists who are part of the abstract expressionist movement, Lee Krasner and others who are part of that movement, and how they really in lots of ways drove abstract expressionism, how they became independent and important artists on their own, all the struggles they had, and they were many. Oftentimes with the men involved in their lives and with being taken seriously. It just really was a really good book looking at this history of these women artists in a way which I thought was really respectful, which I thought was really important. And it was a subject I like and had known a little bit about beforehand. Then also The 100-Year War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. This is a book that really I read and really kind of changed a lot of my perspective on what's been going on between Israel and Palestine over the years, some of which I've known and some of which, I'd already had questions about. But here I think in this one book, and it's short, and Khalidi makes no pretense about his biases, but it does offer a really, I think, valuable and corrective perspective for Americans on the situation between Israel and Palestine, and I thought that was great. And then I just read, matter of fact, in my last video I kind of reviewed Thunderclap by Laura Cumming. Thunderclap, a memoir of art and life and sudden death, which really kind of looks at the world of Dutch art in the period between Rembrandt and Vermeer, and kind of has these little histories of various Dutch artists and why they were important and why their art is far more than just representational or figurative painting about things and people, and how much more depth there is to it. It centers around the work of Fabricius, the artist who painted the goldfinch and other things primarily, and it kind of makes a connection between the author, her father who's an artist, and Fabricius, and I just thought it was really well done, and I think the connections she makes are sometimes kind of out there connections, but I thought it really worked, and plus I thought it was a really great kind of informal history of Dutch painting during that time. So those are all my honorable mentions, I think. Let me look at my card. Yes, those are all my honorable mentions. And now on to my top 5. So these are the 5 best books I've read this year so far, and unlike in past years and unlike with some of my honorable mentions, these are all fairly recent books. They weren't published necessarily in 2024, but I think they were all either published in 2024 or 2023, which is unusual for me. I'm not necessarily one of those who focuses on new releases or new books, but it worked out that way for me. I'm really sure about my 1 and my 2 and my 3, my 4 and my 5 might switch places. So at number 5 I have Blackouts by Justin Torres. I've talked about this book also in my last video, so I won't talk about it very long here, but it tells the story of 2 gay men and their relationship with one another, which doesn't appear to be sexual or romantic. The older of them is dying, and they basically are living together in some kind of facility, I'm going to call it, and they are telling one another stories about their past, about their meeting, and it really, in the telling of those stories, I think they tell a lot of the history of the treatment of gay people in the United States of America up through the AIDS epidemic. And I think that's really powerfully and poignantly and interestingly done. And then also in between there, you have these kind of excerpts from books written about the homosexual community, homosexual people in the United States of America, which are supposed to be these kind of academic books, which really betrayed their bias and were exploitative. And the reason for the title is that one of the characters is looking through this book which belongs to the other, and someone has blacked out a lot of that text, so the story told on the page that's visible is much different than the story that was told theoretically, academically. There are also all kinds of pictures and images which also kind of all relate to this, and it actually deals with some real historical figures who, a lesbian woman who contributed to this, and it's just, and then was disappointed by the outcome. And it really is just, I thought, an incredibly intense, well put together, well crafted, and interesting book. 4 on my list, I have Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy. This was my favorite book that was nominated for the Women's Prize, and it just really spoke to me. And I freely admit that this story, which is the story of a relatively new mother whose child is, I think, around the toddler age, and the struggles that she has with sleep, with a husband who doesn't seem to be pulling his fair share, with her feelings that she isn't being fair to her husband, with her desire for some life outside of motherhood, with feeling limited by all these things, and yet at the same time deeply loving her child and having this connection with the child. And it may be because my daughter had our first grandchild right around the time I started to read this book that it spoke to me more powerfully, but I just thought it was great. I thought it was one of those books which I really felt like I was in, where the emotions in the book really were emotions that I felt. It felt immediate, it felt powerful, it felt like it was just right. I can't remember any place in the book where I thought there was a misstep on the part of the author. I identified with the young woman, and I recognized probably in myself some of the ways in which I, as a father, failed to help my wife in all the ways she needed help when my children were young. But just a really great book. At number 3, I have The Long Form by Kate Briggs, which I also have an independent review of here on my channel. If I can remember, I'll link that down below as well. This is just one of those books that's just a me book. It has all kinds of things going for it. Again, it centers on a young single mother and her infant child, and her desire to maintain some kind of an intellectual life outside of that. So she decides to order a copy of The History of Tom Jones, a novel by Henry Fielding, which is supposed to be kind of the first novel, or many people accept the first novel, and so she's going to kind of attempt to keep her intellectual life going, to keep some kind of intellectual life separate from motherhood and all the problems and travails of motherhood by reading this book. And what the book becomes then is kind of this examination of the novel in the form of a novel. And I just thought it was brilliantly done. It has all kinds of things in it that I like. It has that kind of crossover meta thing between the life being depicted in the pages and connections to Tom Jones. It has images that are supposed to, and diagrams that are supposed to mean things. It was just one of those books. It was just a really great me book. And I thought the story, for attempting to kind of incorporate this more dissection of the novel and what the novel is and what it isn't and what it means and how it works, and to put that in the form of a novel, you might think that the novel itself, the story being told about this young woman and her child, would suffer, but it doesn't. It's still there. It's still very real. It's still very immediate, and I thought it was just a brilliant book. At number 2 on my list, I have Cuddy by Benjamin Myers. This is a work of historical fiction about St. Cuthbert, who is one of the most important saints in northern England, and is kind of a folk hero there. And it kind of tells the story of St. Cuthbert and the town and the cathedral that grew up around St. Cuthbert by looking at 5 different periods in history. The first is, after St. Cuthbert's death, in order to keep his body from being desecrated, a group of, essentially monks and devotees transported his body all over the north of England for years before they finally found the right place to build his cathedral. Then we have a discussion about, then there's a section about the cathedral being built and stonemason, and a story of a love affair between a stonemason and a young woman who's married to a terrible person. And it just keeps going like this. And we get, a vignette where some soldiers are trapped there and being starved to death in the Cathedral of St. Cuthbert. And then we get this effort to exhume St. Cuthbert's body, because there's this rumor that his body had never decayed. And, an Oxford historian gets drawn north and gets caught up in all of this. And then the story of a young man who is, basically just a working class young man with a mother who's very sick, who gets a job working alongside those who are repairing the cathedral. Just brilliant, I thought, historical fiction. And each part of the novel, I thought, worked extremely well. And they all kind of come together to create this kind of world around the cathedral and around St. Cuthbert with all kinds of interlocking storylines. Just a great book. But number 1 on my list, nobody's going to be surprised to find that I put James by Percival Everett as my number 1 book of the year so far. I find it hard to believe that I'm going to read a better book than James this year. James is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn, which is by Mark Twain. in which instead of focusing on Huck Finn and his adventures and kind of the comedy that comes in with Tom Sawyer near the end, and some of the cruel comedy that comes in with Tom Sawyer near the end, we focus on Jim from Huckleberry Finn. And Everett does a great job here of talking about the power of language and reading and the written word. In James, Jim is completely literate. He only speaks in kind of the patois, I guess, of enslaved people to keep the white people happy, to avoid being punished for being too smart, or as people in the South used to call it, uppity. He wants to write. He does write. There's a whole incredibly powerful, moving sequence about a pencil. He has read. He does read. And you know, if you've read Huckleberry Finn, you know there are parts of Huckleberry Finn in which Huck and Jim are separated, and what Everett does is he takes advantage of these separations, that period of separation, to put Jim in positions where, you know, he is confronted with the reality of enslavement and racism in the United States of America. And so when he goes back, he'd essentially escaped. You know, Tom Sawyer, if you know Huckleberry Finn and James, he's escaped because he believed he was going to be sold. So when he goes back, in a sense, he's determined to rescue his family from slavery and to take whatever action is necessary to make that happen. And I think if you read the book, you know, when I first read the book, the ending comes as somewhat of a shock. But I think when you read the book, if you go back and think about it, it comes to the only conclusion you could come to, knowing what we know about Jim, knowing what has happened to Jim, knowing about the realizations Jim has come to. He takes the only action that he feels like he could take and maintain his dignity as a human being. I think this is an incredibly powerful message about maybe one that, you know, I'm hammering hard than Percival Everett would have, about people push to the point where there is no longer any hope by following the rules, and therefore they might feel free to break free from those rules. Anyway, just a really great book, and I've had a really great reading year. So if you've read any of these books, you have thoughts about any of these books, please share them with me in the comment section down below, and as always, thank you for watching.